5 days after my wedding, I stood in the empty living room of the house my husband had promised was going to be our first real home together, and the landlord looked directly at me and said, "You're not the girl from last week." I laughed, the confused, reflexive kind of laugh people make when a sentence doesn't fit into any shape they were prepared for. She didn't laugh back. She just reached into a folder on the kitchen counter, the one she'd brought to finalize our lease paperwork, and pulled out a signed rental application with a photograph clipped to the corner. A woman I had never seen before in my life was smiling out from that photograph, standing in this exact living room, one arm looped through my husband's, wearing an engagement ring that looked exactly like mine. My name is Meredith Sowell. I'm 34 years old, a speech-language pathologist working with kids at an elementary school outside Denver, and until that Tuesday afternoon, I believed I had just married the most patient, most steady man I'd ever dated. I want to tell this story from the beginning because I think the ending only makes sense once you understand exactly how ordinary the beginning felt at the time. I met Julian Bexley at a conference in Scottsdale, the kind of forgettable professional development event with bad coffee and worse lanyards, where I was there for a session on early childhood language delays, and he was there, he told me, consulting for a healthcare logistics company that supplied hospitals with equipment. We ended up at the same overpriced hotel bar on the first night, both of us clearly avoiding the same networking mixer down the hall, and talked for 3 hours about nothing in particular. The kind of easy, unforced conversation that feels rare enough in your 30s that you start paying attention to it before you've even decided to. Julian was, by any measure I had at the time, a genuinely wonderful person to be around. He remembered small details from conversations weeks later. He showed up early. He called when he said he would call, texted good morning without fail, the kind of steady, reliable affection that felt, after a decade of dating men who treated consistency like a weakness, almost disorienting in how good it felt. My best friend Ivy, who has never once been shy about her opinions, liked him immediately, which mattered to me more than I probably admitted out loud, because Ivy had spent the better part of my 20s warning me off men she could see through in about 4 minutes. Our first real date, 2 weeks after Scottsdale, was at a small Italian place near my apartment, and I remember being struck that night by how easily he asked questions and then actually waited for the answers, instead of using my sentences as a runway to talk about himself again. He asked about my parents, both gone by then, my mother to cancer when I was 26, my father to a heart attack 4 years later, and instead of offering the usual, well-meaning platitudes people reach for when grief comes up too early in a relationship, he simply said, "That sounds like it left you having to figure out a lot of things alone," and let the sentence sit there without trying to fix it. I think looking back, that was the moment I decided he was different, and I think, looking back even further now, that was also the exact kind of observation a person learns to make when they've spent years studying what makes women feel safely, deeply understood. We got engaged 8 months after Scottsdale, on a weekend trip to Aspen that he'd planned down to the smallest detail, and married 4 months after that, quickly by most people's standards, though it never felt quick from inside it. Julian had a story, the kind of story that made the timeline make sense at the time. His mother, back in England, had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia, and he wanted her to be lucid enough to understand and remember his wedding, which meant, he explained, gently and apologetically, that waiting the traditional year or two for a big production simply wasn't something he was willing to risk. I want to be honest about the small things that should have registered as strange, because I think that honesty matters more than pretending I walked into this with no warning signs at all. His mother never actually made it to the wedding, a small courthouse ceremony followed by dinner with 20 people at a restaurant I'd chosen, because of a fall, he said, 2 days before the flight. Nothing serious, just enough to make travel unsafe. His side of the guest list was thin, for coworkers I'd met exactly once each, and a cousin named Trevor, who left before dessert. When I asked, gently, over the months of planning, why I'd never met more of his family or seen photos from his childhood beyond a handful of blurry ones on his phone, he told me his family wasn't close, that his father had been distant and difficult, that most of what he had left of home was complicated enough that he preferred not to dwell on it. I accepted that explanation the way you accept most explanations from someone you love, generously, because the alternative required a level of suspicion I didn't yet have any reason to reach for. The wedding itself was small and lovely, exactly the kind of low-key celebration I'd always secretly wanted more than the version everyone else seemed to expect from me. Julian cried during his vows, which surprised me, given how composed he usually was about everything, and I remember thinking, standing there in a courthouse hallway that smelled faintly of industrial carpet cleaner, that I had never felt more certain about a decision in my life. 5 days later, we drove out to a rental house on the edge of a quiet, tree-lined street in a suburb north of the city. A 3-bedroom craftsman Julian had described to me in careful, loving detail over the previous month, telling me he'd already put down a deposit as a surprise, that he wanted our married life to start somewhere that felt like ours from the very first night instead of the cramped 1-bedroom apartment I'd been renting for 6 years. He'd show me photos on his phone, the kitchen, the little fenced backyard, told me the landlord just needed us both there in person to finalize the paperwork and hand over keys. The landlord, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane Kessler, who managed the property along with 4 others in the neighborhood, was already standing in the empty living room when we arrived, a folder of documents tucked under one arm. She smiled at Julian first, the polite, professional smile of someone who'd already met a client once before, and then her eyes moved to me, and something in her expression shifted, quickly, in a way I noticed before I understood why. "You're not the girl from last week," she said. I laughed. I want to be honest about that because it's the detail I keep returning to, how genuinely funny the sentence sounded to me for the first 3 or 4 seconds before the meaning of it caught up with the sound of it. "I'm sorry?" Diane's eyes moved to Julian, whose face had gone very still, the particular, careful stillness of a man doing rapid math behind his own expression. "Mr. Bexley signed the lease application with his fiancée last Tuesday," she said, slower now, watching both of us. "A young woman, blonde. I have her paperwork right here." She opened the folder and set it on the empty kitchen counter, and there it was, a rental application with Julian's signature at the bottom, dated 8 days earlier, 3 days before our wedding, and beside it a second signature, a name I had never once heard him say. Whitney Marsh. Clipped to the corner of the application was a photograph, printed from what looked like a phone camera, the two of them standing in this exact living room, Julian's arm around a woman I had never seen before in my life, a woman wearing an engagement ring that, even from across the counter, looked close enough to mine that my stomach dropped before my brain had finished processing why. I didn't scream. I didn't cry, not yet, not in that kitchen with a stranger watching. I just stood very still, the way you stand still when the ground under you turns out to be a different material than you thought it was, and looked at my husband of 5 days, waiting for him to say something that would make any of it make sense. "Meredith," he started, and something about the specific, careful way he said my name told me, before he'd said another word, that whatever came next was going to be a version of the truth built for damage control instead of honesty. "Who is Whitney Marsh?" I said. My voice came out flatter than I expected it to, the way it does when your body decides, on its own, to protect you from feeling the full weight of something before you're ready to. "It's not what it looks like," he said, which is, I've since learned, one of the most reliable phrases in the entire language for confirming that something is exactly what it looks like. Diane cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable being caught in the middle of whatever this had suddenly become, and told us she'd give us a moment, stepping out onto the front porch with her folder still tucked under her arm. I remember watching her go, watching the screen door swing shut behind her, and feeling, for the first time since I'd met Julian 8 months earlier, genuinely unsafe in his presence, not physically, but in some deeper, more disorienting way, the way you feel unsafe when you realize the map you've been navigating your entire relationship by might not correspond to any real territory at all. "Start talking," I said. "Now." Before I walk out that door and call every person on our wedding guest list to ask if they knew anything about this. Diane cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable being caught in the middle of whatever this had suddenly become, and told us she'd give us a moment, stepping out onto the front porch with her folder still tucked under her arm. I remember watching her go, watching the screen door swing shut behind her, and feeling, for the first time since I'd met Julian 8 months earlier, genuinely unsafe in his presence, not physically, but in some deeper, more disorienting way, the way you feel unsafe when you realize the map you've been navigating your entire relationship by might not correspond to any real territory at all. "Start talking," I said. "Now." before I walk out that door and call every person on our wedding guest list to ask if they knew anything about this. He talked for almost 20 minutes, standing in that empty living room, and I want to be honest that even as he talked, I could feel him constructing the story in real time, adjusting it, softening pieces of it, watching my face for which version I might be willing to accept. Whitney, he said, was someone he dated briefly, months earlier, before he'd met me, and things had ended badly, and she'd been, his word, unstable about it, showing up places, calling, and he'd agreed to look at this rental with her weeks ago, before Scottsdale, before any of it, just to placate her, just to keep the peace while things cooled down naturally. That's not what a rental application with both your signatures and her name listed as your fiancé looks like, Julian, I said. That's not placating someone. That's planning a life with them. He didn't have an answer for that. I watched him search for one. The same searching I would later come to recognize as the specific look of a man who has run out of prepare material and is now simply hoping momentum and charm will carry him the rest of the way, I suspect, they always had before. He tried a different angle after that, softer, his voice dropping into the same low, careful register he used to use when he thought I was upset about something small, work stress, a fight with my sister, anything he could soothe with enough patience and the right tone. Meredith, look at me, he said. You're my wife. 5 days ago, I stood in front of everyone we care about and told you that. Does that sound like a man who's planning a future with someone else? I don't know anymore what any of your sentences sound like, I said. That's the problem. I used to think I did. I picked my purse up off the empty kitchen counter, the same counter where Diane's folder still sat, the photograph of Whitney and Julian standing in this exact room still visible from where I stood. I'm leaving. Don't follow me to Ivy's. I mean that. He didn't stay in that house. I walked out to my car, Julian following me across the lawn saying my name in increasingly urgent tones, and I drove to Ivy's apartment without calling first, sat on her couch, and told her everything in the flat, dissociated voice of someone still too far inside the shock to have found her way to the feelings underneath it yet. Ivy didn't say I told you so, though I think we both understood she'd earned the right to. She made tea neither of us drank, sat down beside me on the couch, and let me talk in circles for the better part of an hour, repeating the same handful of details, the photograph, the ring, the name Whitney Marsh, the way you repeat details when your mind hasn't yet figured out how to file them anywhere useful. At some point, well past midnight, she got up, came back with a legal pad from the drawer under her television, and set it on the coffee table in front of me. I know you don't want to think clearly right now, she said. But I also know you, and I know that by tomorrow morning you're going to want to have thought clearly about this tonight, so we're going to write down everything you remember while it's still fresh, dates, names, anything he ever said that didn't quite add up. Not because I think you're going to need it. Just in case. I want to be honest about how much that legal pad ended up mattering over the following weeks, more than either of us could have guessed sitting on that couch at 1 a.m. It became the skeleton of everything I eventually handed to Detective Alvarez, the first, rawest draft of a timeline that would later get organized, cross-referenced, and expanded by Whitney's far more practiced hand. But that night, it was just a way to keep my own mind from spinning without an anchor, a list of ordinary facts laid out in Ivy's neat handwriting because mine was shaking too badly to hold a pen steady. She just sat beside me, quiet for a long moment once the list was finished, and then asked the question that ended up mattering more than any comfort she could have offered instead. Do you actually think Whitney is the only one? I hadn't thought about it that way yet, hadn't had time to consider that whatever this was might be bigger than a single overlapping relationship, a single bad decision Julian had made in the weeks before our wedding. But the moment Ivy said it out loud, something cold and clear settled into place in my chest, the specific, unnerving clarity of realizing you might be looking at the smallest visible piece of something much larger. I didn't go home that night, to the apartment Julian and I had been slowly moving my things out of over the past 2 weeks in preparation for the house that, it turned out, might never have actually been ours to begin with. I stayed at Ivy's and, the next morning, instead of calling Julian, I did something that would have felt a week earlier like a strange, almost paranoid thing to do. I searched Whitney Marsh's name online. It didn't take long to find her. A public profile, a handful of photos, a location tag from a coffee shop in a suburb 30 minutes from where I lived. I sat at Ivy's kitchen table for almost an hour, staring at a stranger's face, trying to decide what kind of person I wanted to be in this exact moment. The kind who confronts quietly and carefully, or the kind who lets rage make the decision for her. I chose quietly. I sent Whitney Marsh a message, short, direct, giving her only the barest outline of what I'd learned the day before, and asked if she'd be willing to talk. She called me within the hour, her voice shaking in a way that told me, before she'd said more than a few sentences, that whatever I was about to hear was going to be worse than I'd braced myself for. Whitney had met Julian 14 months earlier, at a different conference, in a different city, a story so similar to my own that hearing her describe it felt like listening to an echo of my own life delivered back to me in a stranger's voice. They'd gotten engaged 9 months in. They'd been actively planning a wedding, dress fittings, a venue deposit, a date set for the following spring. 3 weeks before I met her, she told me, Julian had told her his work required him to relocate temporarily to Phoenix for an extended project, that he'd be back and forth for months, and that they should hold off on finalizing the venue until his schedule settled. She had believed him. She had signed a rental application within the week before my wedding because he'd told her they should start looking at places together for after they were married, get ahead of the market before prices rose in the spring. He told me he loved me 2 days ago, Whitney said, her voice cracking on the sentence. 2 days ago, over the phone from Phoenix. He wasn't in Phoenix, I said quietly. He was marrying me. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. When she finally spoke again, her voice had changed, gone from shaking to something harder, more focused. I want to see everything you have, she said. Every piece of it. I think we need to find out exactly how big this actually is before either of us decides what to do next. We met in person 2 days later, at a diner equidistant from both our apartments. 2 women who had never met before sitting across a laminate table comparing screenshots, dates, photographs, timelines, the way you'd compare notes for a case study instead of pieces of your own broken life. Whitney arrived with a folder of her own, thicker than I expected, organized with color-coded tabs, and I remember thinking, watching her lay it all out across the table between the ketchup and the sugar packets, that whatever job had trained her to build a case like that so quickly was about to become the single most useful thing in both our lives. I do forensic accounting for an insurance firm, she explained, when she caught me staring at the folder. Fraud investigation, mostly. I spend my whole professional life looking for exactly this kind of pattern in other people's finances. I just never thought to look for it in my own relationship until it was already this far along. She said it without self-pity, in the same flat, methodical tone she used for everything that afternoon, and I found myself grateful for it, grateful to be sitting across from someone who had decided, apparently within hours of learning the truth, to convert her devastation into something useful instead of letting it sit in her chest unprocessed the way mine still was. What emerged, over the following 3 weeks of careful, methodical digging, mostly led by Whitney, who turned out to have a background in forensic accounting that made her frighteningly good at exactly this kind of work, was a pattern far larger and far more calculated than either of us had initially imagined. She pulled property records, cross-referenced names, tracked down old social media accounts that hadn't been updated in years but hadn't been deleted either, the kind of quiet, patient research that never would have occurred to me to attempt on my own, exhausted and heartbroken as I still was most evenings that month. Julian Bexley was not, as far as we could determine, actually named Julian Bexley, not originally. Whitney found a property record under a different last name, Cole, tied to an address in Tucson from 6 years earlier, connected to a woman named Priya Anand, who, it turned out, when Whitney finally worked up the nerve to call her, had married a man matching Julian's exact description 4 years earlier, a man who had disappeared 11 months into their marriage, taking with him roughly $60,000 from a joint account he'd convinced her to open for a home renovation that never happened. Priya, when I finally spoke with her myself, was quieter than Whitney, more guarded, the particular kind of guarded that comes from having already lived through this once and having to rebuild trust in strangers, including strangers calling to tell her the man who'd once emptied her savings account was still out there doing it to other women. She told me she'd spent almost 2 years after he disappeared assuming, or at least hoping, that she'd simply been an isolated, unlucky case, a single bad relationship rather than one entry in a longer pattern. "You tell yourself it was just you," she said on our second phone call, once she decided she trusted me enough to talk at length. "It's easier than the alternative." The alternative means admitting you were never actually special to him at all, just convenient, the same as whoever came before you and whoever came after. I want to sit with that number for a moment because I think it's important to understand what we were actually looking at by then. This wasn't a man who had gotten cold feet, or fallen for someone else at an inconvenient time, or made a series of understandable, human mistakes in the weeks before a wedding. This was a pattern, repeated at least 3 times that we could document, possibly more, of a man identifying women who were financially stable, emotionally available, and reasonably private about their personal lives, building relationships with them on parallel, overlapping timelines, extracting money and trust from each of them in turn, and disappearing, or attempting to, once the structure of the deception became unsustainable. Priya put us in touch with a detective she'd worked with years earlier, a patient, methodical man named Detective Alvarez who had never managed to build a strong enough case against Julian, under whatever name he'd been using at the time, to bring formal charges, mostly because Priya, alone, hadn't had documentation solid enough to establish intent rather than simple financial mismanagement between partners. 3 women's documentation together, however, was a different thing entirely. I met with Detective Alvarez myself the following week, bringing everything I had, the rental application Diane Kessler had photographed for me before we left the house that day, the messages Julian had sent me in the weeks leading up to the wedding describing the house as a surprise he'd already secured, bank statements showing a joint account he'd asked me to open 2 months into our engagement. One I'd contributed $11,000 to for what he described as wedding expenses, and a security deposit on our future home, an account I could no longer access because I discovered that same week, sitting in Detective Alvarez's small, cluttered office, Julian had quietly transferred the balance out 3 days before our wedding. Alvarez listened the way I imagine he'd learned to listen after 20 years of cases like this one, without visible surprise, without interrupting, taking notes in a slow, deliberate hand that somehow made the whole conversation feel less frantic than it would have otherwise. When I finished, he sat back in his chair for a moment before speaking. "I want you to understand something," he said. "None of what you just described happened because you missed obvious signs or weren't careful enough. Men who do this professionally, and I do mean professionally, are good at exactly one thing, making careful, intelligent people feel like the carefulness was their own idea the whole time. You weren't careless. You were targeted by someone who'd had a lot of practice." I didn't fully believe him that day. Not completely, though I've come, slowly, over the following year, to understand he was right. "This is significant," he added, reviewing the documents with the same unhurried, careful attention I imagined he brought to every case that had finally accumulated enough weight to be worth his full attention. "Combined with what Ms. Anand and Ms. Marsh have already provided, we may have enough here to pursue this as a pattern of financial fraud, potentially bigamy charges as well, depending on what we find when we pull his actual marriage records under whichever name he's used legally." The word bigamy landed strangely, clinically, the way words do when they describe something that's actually happening to you instead of something you've only ever encountered in a news story about someone else's life. I sat in that office and thought about my own marriage certificate, folded neatly into a drawer at Ivy's apartment where I'd been staying for 3 weeks by then, and wondered, for the first time, whether it had ever actually been valid to begin with. It hadn't. Detective Alvarez confirmed, 10 days later, that Julian Bexley, whose legal name turned out to be Julian Andrew Coletti, had a marriage on record in Nevada from 7 years earlier that had never been formally dissolved to a woman neither Whitney, Priya, nor I had ever heard mentioned once. My marriage to him, 5 days before Diane Kessler stood in that empty living room and unraveled the entire structure of my new life with a single sentence, had never legally existed at all. I want to describe the moment I found that out because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this story. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the collapse I'd braced myself for over the previous 3 weeks of slowly, methodically discovering exactly how much of my marriage had been built on nothing. What I felt, instead, sitting in Ivy's kitchen with the phone still warm in my hand from Alvarez's call, was something closer to relief, the strange, unexpected relief of finally understanding that I hadn't failed at a marriage. There had never been a marriage to fail at in the first place. There had only been a very patient, very practiced man and 3 women who had each, in our own separate lives, mistaken his patience for love. The 3 of us, Whitney, Priya, and I, decided together, over a long dinner at Priya's house 2 weeks later, exactly how we wanted this to end. We could have simply handed everything to Alvarez and let the legal process take whatever shape it was going to take, quietly, out of sight, the way most fraud cases eventually resolve, in courtrooms most people never hear about. But Julian, it turned out, was scheduled to meet Whitney the following Saturday at a restaurant downtown, still telling her, even then, even after everything, that his Phoenix project was almost finished and they could finally start planning the wedding properly. We spent that dinner at Priya's kitchen table the same way Whitney and I had once spent an afternoon at a diner, methodically, carefully. Only this time we weren't building a case. We were building a plan. Priya, who had the most distance from the situation by then for years of it, was the one who suggested it first. "He's never had to face more than one of us at a time," she said. "That's the whole architecture of what he does. He keeps every version of his life in a separate room and never lets the doors open into each other. I think the only thing that's actually going to land, the only thing he won't have a script prepared for, is watching all 3 doors open at once." We decided, the 3 of us, that he should get exactly that meeting, just not the one he was expecting. Whitney arrived first, alone, exactly as planned, and sat across from him at a table Priya and I could see clearly from a booth near the entrance, close enough to watch his face as he leaned in, took her hand, apologized for the distance the past few months had put between them, the same easy, practiced warmth I remembered from a hotel bar in Scottsdale, the same warmth I imagine he'd once used on Priya, years earlier, in some other city, before any of us existed to each other as anything more than strangers who happened to love the same man at different times. I watched his thumb trace slow circles across the back of her hand, the exact same small gesture he used to do to me across restaurant tables, and felt something in my chest go cold and clear, the specific clarity of watching a magic trick performed a second time once you already know exactly how it works. I stood up first. Priya followed. We crossed the restaurant together, and I watched Julian's face change in real time, the exact sequence I imagine Whitney had once described, the color leaving it in stages, disbelief, then recognition, then something closer to fear. Once he understood that the 3 women standing at his table weren't a coincidence. "Meredith," he said, and then, seeing Priya beside me, went very quiet, the particular quiet of a man finally running out of new versions of the truth to offer. "This is Priya," I said, keeping my voice level, the same level voice I'd been practicing in my head for 3 weeks. "You were married to her once. Legally, actually, unlike me, since you apparently never bothered ending that one either." Whitney didn't move from her seat, didn't say a word, just watched him with an expression I recognized completely, the specific stillness of someone finally seeing, all at once, the full shape of something they'd only ever been shown in careful, curated pieces. "I don't understand what's happening right now," Julian said, which struck me, even in that moment, as almost impressively dishonest, a man still reaching for a script even after every possible version of the script had already run out. "You understand exactly what's happening," Priya said quietly. "You just never thought the 3 of us would end up in the same room." A waiter approached the table, sensing something had shifted, and Whitney waved him off without looking away from Julian's face, the first time all evening she'd said anything at all. "We're fine," she told him. "We won't be staying long." Her voice was steadier than I expected it to be, steadier, I think, than mine would have been if our positions had been reversed, and I understood, watching her, that she had spent the better part of 3 weeks preparing for exactly this moment in a way none of the rest of us fully appreciated until we saw it land. We didn't stay long after that. There was no dramatic scene, no thrown drinks, no raised voices that turned every head in the restaurant. We'd agreed, beforehand, that we didn't need any of that the value of the moment wasn't in how loud we could make it, but in how completely it dismantled, in under 2 minutes, a structure Julian had spent years carefully building. We simply told him that Detective Alvarez would be in touch, that all 3 of our documentation had already been submitted, and that whatever conversation he wanted to have going forward, he'd be having it with a lawyer instead of any of us. I walked out of that restaurant first, into a cold, clear evening that felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, like it belonged entirely to me again. The legal process that followed took the better part of a year, slower and more procedural than the version of justice you see in movies, mostly financial restitution proceedings rather than the dramatic courtroom reckonings I sometimes found myself imagining in the early months. Detective Alvarez kept the 3 of us updated in careful, measured phone calls every few weeks, walking us through the slow accumulation of evidence, additional records that surfaced once investigators started pulling threads Whitney had already half unraveled on her own, a 4th woman in Sacramento whose name none of us recognized, a bank account under yet another variation of his name that had moved money through 3 states in under 2 years. Each new detail landed differently than I expected it to by then, less like a fresh wound and more like a piece of a puzzle finally clicking into a picture that had already, mostly, made itself clear. Julian, or Julian Andrew Coletti, whichever name eventually appeared on the paperwork, pled to a set of fraud charges that resulted in restitution orders none of us expected to ever fully collect, and a suspended sentence that felt, if I'm honest, smaller than the scale of what he'd done to at least 3 lives across nearly a decade. I sat in on part of the sentencing hearing, not required to, but wanting to see it through to some kind of formal ending, and watched him stand at a podium reading a prepared statement about accountability and growth that sounded, even then, like it had been written by someone still more concerned with managing an audience's perception than reckoning with what he'd actually done. I've made peace, mostly, with the fact that the legal system rarely delivers the exact shape of consequence you imagine it will. What mattered more to me, in the end, was simply that it was over, documented, closed, no longer a private wound I was carrying alone in the dark. I moved back into my old apartment, the 1-bedroom I'd been so eager to leave behind 5 days into what I thought was going to be my married life, and found, to my own surprise, that it felt less like a step backward than I'd expected it to. Ivy helped me repaint the bedroom that spring, a soft, deliberate blue I'd wanted for years and never quite gotten around to, and I remember standing in the doorway once we'd finished, feeling something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt since the week before my wedding, a kind of quiet, uncomplicated ownership over my own life. Whitney and I still talk, not constantly, but regularly, the strange, specific bond of 2 people who met each other under the worst possible circumstances and found, underneath the wreckage, something worth keeping. She's engaged again, to someone she's been dating for over a year now, someone I've met twice and liked both times, someone who, she told me recently, laughing, has met every single member of his own family in person, repeatedly, which she now considers, only half-jokingly, a non-negotiable relationship requirement. We went dress shopping together last month, an ordinary, happy afternoon that felt almost strange in how normal it was. 2 women who once sat across a laminate diner table building a fraud case now standing in a boutique dressing room arguing cheerfully about necklines. Priya and I exchange messages a few times a year, mostly around the holidays. 2 women whose lives only ever crossed because of a man neither of us wanted anything more to do with, and who found, in each other, a kind of unexpected, hard-won solidarity that neither of us went looking for. She sent me a card after the sentencing hearing, a simple one, just a few lines, thanking me for reaching out that first week instead of quietly disappearing back into my own life, the way she said most people probably would have. I keep that card in a drawer in my nightstand, not because I need reminding of any of it, but because it's one of the only good things that came directly out of something so thoroughly bad, and I've learned not to throw those away, however small they are. I think about Diane Kessler sometimes, standing in that empty living room with a folder under her arm, delivering a single sentence that unraveled 5 days of a marriage I'd believed in completely. I've thought about reaching out to thank her, properly, for paying close enough attention to notice that something didn't add up, for caring enough about her own paperwork to say something instead of simply handing over the keys and letting the details sort themselves out later. I never have, mostly because I'm not sure there's a version of that conversation that wouldn't require reliving the whole thing out loud again, and some days, I still need the distance more than I need the closure. What I know now, more than a year past that Tuesday afternoon, is that the version of myself who stood in that kitchen laughing at a sentence that didn't make sense yet was already, without knowing it, about to become someone steadier than she'd ever had reason to be before. I didn't fall apart the way I might have expected to, standing in an empty rental house discovering my marriage had a hole in the exact center of it. I got curious instead, methodical, patient in a way that surprised even me, and that patience turned out to be worth more, in the end, than any amount of grief I could have spent on a man who had never actually been who he said he was in the first place. I've thought a lot since then about the version of that week where I might have made a different choice, where I might have believed Julian's explanation in the empty living room, chosen the easier, softer story instead of the messier true one, and let Whitney fade into a rumor I never fully investigated. I think about how easy that would have been, how tempting, given how much I wanted in that first hour for the whole thing to simply be a misunderstanding I could forgive my way out of. I don't think less of anyone who might have made that choice instead. I just know, now, that the version of me who chose to keep asking questions instead of accepting the first comfortable answer ended up saving not only herself, but two other women who were still, at that exact moment, believing every word he said. I got my name legally changed back within a month, not because Meredith Bexley had ever really existed on paper to begin with, but because I wanted the clean, deliberate act of choosing my own name again, on my own terms, after months of having so much chosen for me by a man who had never once told me the truth about anything that actually mattered. I signed the paperwork at the same courthouse where we'd been married 5 days before it all came apart, and walked out into the parking lot afterward feeling lighter than I had and longer than I wanted to admit. I started dating again about 8 months ago, slowly, carefully, with a wariness I don't think will ever fully leave me, and honestly, I've decided I'm at peace with that. I ask more questions now than I used to, earlier, more directly about family, about past relationships, about the small, specific details that used to feel rude to press for. The man I'm seeing now, a high school science teacher named Colin, laughed the first time I asked him for his mother's phone number 2 dates in, and then, when he realized I wasn't joking, simply gave it to me without a hint of defensiveness, which told me more about him in that single moment than 3 months of easy conversation ever could have. If any part of this story sounds familiar to you, if you've ever caught a detail that didn't quite add up and talked yourself out of trusting it, I hope you'll trust it a little faster than I did. Let me know in the comments what city you're tuning in from tonight. I always love watching where these stories end up traveling. And if this one kept you here until the very end, consider sticking around for the next one, because there's no shortage of stories like this still waiting to be told.